Well, hello there. Welcome back, my friends. Ty Lopez smiles down upon us all from his garage in the Hollywood Hills because today is a day of knowledge, of magic, of change. And the only change we can believe in this twisted, hateful world is the unchecked cell growth of mutation and chaos in its purest form. We've covered the campaign mechanics for Tzeentch, and rightfully, I think we can all agree they were rather bananas in pajamas. The Changer of Ways has some busted, stupidly OP looking content ready for launch day, but now it's time to focus on their unit roster and see what information we can glean from the reveal today. There's some surprises here to be sure, not just in terms of the army list itself, but battle mechanics that may or may not make the final cut, and a lot more detail on how exactly these units will function on the battlefields of Warhammer 3. So without further ado, let's have a quick look, shall we? And then we'll dive into the meat and potatoes of this video. So, for Legendary Lords, there is one and only Kairos Fateweaver, the Oracle of Tzeentch. For generic Lords, we have an Exalted Lord of Change and a Herald of Tzeentch, riding a Disc of Tzeentch or Burning Chariot into battle. Both can wield either the Lore of Tzeentch or the Lore of Metal. For Tzeentch Heroes, the Cultists of Tzeentch can only use the Lore of Fire, but we'll get some awesome bound spells I'll talk about later in the video. You can ride a Chaos Steed into battle, and the Iridescent Horror can ride a Disc of Tzeentch or a Burning Chariot. For Tzeentch Infantry, we have Blue Horrors and Forsaken. For Missile Infantry, we have Pink Horrors and Exalted Pink Horrors. For Cav and Chariots, Chaos Knights on Chaos Steeds, Doom Knights on Discs of Tzeentch, and the Burning Chariot. And for Monsters and Beasts, the Soul Grinder, Chaos Furies, Screamers, Chaos Spawn, Lords of Change, Flamers, and Exalted Flamers, the Pyrocaster variant. Those are single entities, and they look pretty cool. Goblin Shark looking motherlickers. Very interesting stuff. Now, from the demonic side, it's pretty much exactly what we expected. The entire Tzeentch demonic roster from 8th edition is present, barring a few characters, of course. Now, there aren't many units to choose from on that front, so perhaps not incredibly shocking, but still good to see. Won't be seeing the Changeling or the Blue Scribes for a little while yet, but overall, awesome to see the entire demonic side represented. I love seeing official army books get well represented without needing tons of DLC to get them into a playable state, which was not really the case for every faction we've had in the trilogy up to this point. Skaven in Game 2 are a good example. I wouldn't say they felt like an incredibly filled faction until we had Ikit Claw and the Clan Scryer DLC. Now, one of the most exciting parts of this reveal is the description of Barrier, which is crazy good from the sounds of it. This unique Tzeentch battle passive protects each and every unit on the roster and is a defensive shield that regenerates quickly outside of combat and negates all incoming damage, serving as a secondary HP bar, which means that fast hit and run attacks will allow units like Screamers and Doom Knights on Discs to slam into a flank, then retreat while the barrier is still up and active, taking 0 HP loss in the exchange. And this can be buffed in your tech tree and campaign skill trees as well. So yeah, that is a huge deal. I don't expect Barrier will be able to take much punishment before caving and giving way to the real HP bar, but still, having a legit 100% ward save, even for only a couple seconds, that will automatically refill when you're lining up for another charge, will make some of those squishy mobile units a much more attractive proposition, and is a direct solution to the frustrations a lot of people have with cavalry and flyers in campaign. Essentially, you charge in from the flank, you would still take some HP damage, and then over time, you just get worn down because low melee defense equals getting pooped on. You aren't going to be dropping models if you've got a 100% ward save and you disengage before that bubble pops. I really like how that sounds. If you micro well, you can wreck an opponent with a trait like that one. Now, you might also notice CA is clearly trying to distinguish the 4 Chaos Gods from each other as much as humanly possible, or demonically possible might be a better term, focusing on each of their strengths and accentuating their weaknesses to the absolute limit. Whereas Khorne had 5 melee infantry units to draw from, as a race that thrives in close quarters combat, Tzeentch only has 2, and in fact he's entirely missing Chaos Warriors or Chosen of any kind. Yeah, the dudes we saw in the background of Cathay's reveal just straight up do not exist at the moment. They did not make the final cut. Now, was that because of community backlash? A response to make it more clear that something's planned for them later down the line? Or were they never intended to show up at all and someone in marketing just added them to screenshots for the lulz? I have no idea, but Chaos Knights did make the final roster, and they will actually play quite a bit differently than the Shock Cav we're used to seeing from the Dark Gods. Talk more about that in a minute. My initial impression, seeing this roster in its totality for the first time, and comparing it to what's been shown in gameplay and trailers, is that because we've seen so little of the Doom Knights or the Chaos Knights, I think CA might be going back to the whiteboard with them and sprucing up their models a bit before launch. Or they could just be hiding them from the general public. Could go either way on that front, but regardless, demons are the clear focus for now, and we'll get a sexier taste of the mortal stuff when Zongors, Chosen Variants, and Mutalith Vortex Beasts make their grand debut alongside characters like Village the Curseling and others in Lord Pack DLC and perhaps free LC as well. And that's when I think we should expect the more exciting visuals for Marked Warriors to start popping out for everybody, even if that's not necessarily what we want. Now, Kairos, of course, is our first and only legendary lord for Tzeentch, soon to be joined by a host of mighty named mages in demonic and mortal chaos lord form. Aggrum von Horseman comes to mind after my boy Village, but Kairos, the twin-headed Lord of Change, provides devastating flames, high mobility, and according to CA anyway, heavy melee damage. I will be very curious to see how far they decide to push his tabletop and lore badness in close quarters combat. Remember, he had a substantially worse melee stat line than your run-of-the-mill Greater Demon of Tzeentch, simply because he can't see the present, only the past and future. It would not shock me if they mostly skip that element of his character, just because it might be a bit jarring for newer players if they pick a legendary version of a Lord of Change that's much weaker in some aspects than a generic version of the same creature, but we'll see. I would like him to be way better at casting magic and dominating opponents from range, which realistically he will be, but I think he should still retain those poor melee stats that made him so unique in the source material. Usually, legendary lords are just better at everything. I think it's kind of cool to see the dichotomy of a character who is amazing at one side and significantly worse in another area of the battlefield. He can equip fragments of magic before each and every single battle, giving him unique access to different lores and spells anytime he's getting ready for a fight, and his Staff of Tomorrow reduces all his spell cooldowns instantly, while Gaze of Fate lets him paralyze a unit, netting them in place and severely reducing their melee attack, which will pair very nicely with all the range damage Tzeentch can unleash. Freeze them in place, bathe them in Warp Flame, give them additional weakness to fire, hit them with more Infernos of Change, and watch as they melt away to ash. Gonna be brutal stuff. For the generic lords, we have Exalted Lords of Change and Heralds of Tzeentch. The Exalted appears to be missing his cranium in this concept art. That image is cursed, but it's just as planned, so nothing to worry about, I guess. And as we know now, they can toggle flight on a whim, changing between a ground monster and a highly mobile flying caster, which is probably tied to the last time the unit was hit in melee by an opponent. So if you're being hounded by cav or dogs and they don't want you to take off, you will likely not be able to take flight until that nuisance is dealt with. It's probably going to work the exact same way that flying away does currently in Warhammer 2. You just now have the option to toggle between ground or flying, depending on what you're facing. So if you're up against a horde of Royal Pegasus Knights and you don't want to deal with any of that, well, you can decide to just land them and run around with your Lord of Change on the ground, which is a really nice feature. And it's not just a nice feature for Tzeentch, it's a nice feature for every single Chaos faction. You wouldn't want to see a Bloodthirster, which is one of the strongest single entities in all of Warhammer, get crushed by Lewin and a bunch of Pegasi up in the air simply because it cannot land. That would be super stupid. So thankfully CA hit that feature and finally gave us what we were asking for on that front. Great work from them there. But y'all know what Sartorial's capable of. Powerful melee combatant, fantastic mage as well. Gonna be the same thing here for the Greater Demons. They're casting spells. They will fuel additional army abilities of the God of Magic, which lets them summon arcane bombardments and vortexes from the warp. And it sounds like that mechanic is actually not specifically tied just to Lords of Change, but to your army on the whole. Separate from Winds of Magic, separate from your caster spell selection, empowered by all your spell casting, including bound spells from some of your rank and file troops as well. These are army abilities, so the more you cast, the more that bar charges up, the more of these bombardments you can unleash that are irrespective of your Winds of Magic pool. That sounds awesome. Tzeentch is sounding nutty on the battlefield side of things too. Their campaign's crazy. Sounds like they'll be pretty bananas on the battlefield as well. Now, as for the lore of Tzeentch, we're looking at blue fire magic missiles, Pink Fire direct damage, Treason of Tzeentch Hex, Glean Magic direct damage, Tzeentch's Firestorm direct damage, and Infernal Gateway, which in the tabletop, guess what, was also direct damage, but I think in Warhammer 3 has a good chance of being a wind spell or vortex. CA will probably add some differentiation between those spells just so they're not all just point and click direct damage, but there's a lot of that because this is a purely offensive school of magic. Curiously missing though is the Bolt of Change magic missile that will probably be a bound spell for Lords and Heroes. Lore of Tzeentch will of course be contrasted by the Lore of Metal, which is the other lore exalted Lords of Change and Heralds of Tzeentch can wield, and Heralds of Tzeentch are fat little burbs of doom, kind of hilarious model, and they can ride either a Disc of Tzeentch or a Burning Chariot, swooping across the battlefield and unleashing maddening energies at would-be attackers. The Burning Chariot sounds absolutely insane. I think it's going to live up to the lofty #1 spot I put it on for my top 5 crazy units video from a few years back. I think it's going to be amazing. Maybe one of those doom stackable ones, but certainly enough killing power to wreck huge sections of enemy armies. Now for heroes, we have the Mortal Cultist of Tzeentch and the Iridescent Horror. The Cultist has that sexy looking moon face mask, really liking the design there, and the text is kind of hilarious too. Interpreting their god's wishes is more challenging than for the straightforward Khorne or Slaanesh, whose copious amounts of bodily fluids are usually enough. Jizz. They can mount a Chaos Steed, which is hopefully bigger than the ponies from Game 1 and Game 2. Looks like it might be if the trailers are anything to go by. The steeds are looking quite a bit larger, but might just be forced perspective rather than any actual change. We can hope. And they have unique access to the lore of Fire, which is the only lore they can start off with. But as they grow in power, and this is a big one, they can learn to summon demons directly from the realms of chaos, including Lords of Change. That is freaking sick, dude. Summoning is a huge part of cultist rituals and demonic lore in general, so to see that element represented is a big deal for the armies of the Dark Gods. I don't think we heard much, if anything, about Khornate summoning. I think it makes a little bit more sense for Tzeentch, although summoning is still a big deal for Khorne as well. I think it should be a part of all of their factions, and any mechanics they can add that reflect that are going to be a good thing for the game. The Iridescent Horror is a pink horror blessed by Tzeentch with more authority and sanity. It's a hero version essentially of the Herald, riding either a disc or a burning chariot. For Tzeentch Infantry, blue horrors are up next, functioning as low-tier meat shields and chaff, and they sound like they'll almost have a precursor javelin volley of vomitous fire before they charge into melee, perhaps like the Chameleon Stalker explosive blowpipes we got in the Silence and the Fury. Forsaken of Tzeentch are Forsaken. Don't need to spend much time on them, other than to say you might use them a bit more than usual, simply because you don't have better options when it comes to melee infantry. And for missile infantry, pink horrors are the dedicated range lesser demon of Tzeentch, vomiting hellfire that will demolish tightly packed, low-tier chaff for other factions, while being better in melee than their crappy blue cousins. Interesting element to note here, it appears that pink horrors will not split into blue horrors upon death. Either CA's working out how to do that appropriately, or they've simply scrapped that idea altogether, but all we know is they haven't shown any split mechanics so far, and still haven't talked about it either. If they were going to reveal it, now would have been a logical time with the Tzeentch roster reveal. So, at least for now, go in with the expectation that horrors are pink, horrors are blue, where once there was one, now there won't be two. It just won't be a thing until we hear otherwise. Perhaps disappointing, but maybe they're holding on to that reveal for later for some reason. Realistically, I think they would have revealed it here if it was a feature. Exalted Pink Horrors of Tzeentch are further upgraded versions, whose fiery salvos will outdamage even the Celestial Dragon crossbows of Cathay, which is a bit crazy considering they were playing up their range DPS a ton. So if they can outdamage them, that's very impressive. And they passively increase your Winds of Magic reserve as well, so that's probably a doomstack, man. If they can kill infantry, cav, and single entities, that is going to be a vicious and cost-effective doomstack that will make even your lords and heroes better too, because it's increasing your Winds of Magic pool. Now onto Tzeentch Cavalry and Chariots. Chaos Knights of Tzeentch are perhaps a bit of a surprise here. Again, no Chosen or Chaos Warriors, but these heavily armored mounted warriors will still perform a bit of a similar role because they are described as being incredibly tanky, almost like a frontliner troop, which we haven't really seen from Cav in the trilogy up to this point. None of them are really designed for a brawl, but from CA's description here, perhaps these guys will be. Apparently they lack the massive impact damage of standard Lance Cav, but are far more effective in a pitched, sustained battle when they're stuck in. And with the addition of Barrier, they must be one of the most resilient Cav units we've seen in the trilogy up to this point. I cannot wait to see how far we can push that 100% recharging ward save. Very exciting from a gameplay perspective anyway. I'm just a little hesitant on how the models will actually look. Now, the Doom Knights of Tzeentch are the flying disc equivalent, elite aerial shot cav that are more than a match for any foe, trading some of the high armor and defense of Chaos Knights for vastly more speed and punching power, and as CA puts it, they are the strongest melee-focused unit in Tzeentch's arsenal. Period. The Burning Chariot of Tzeentch is the unit I'm personally most excited for on this roster, ridden into battle like a blazing comet with Exalted Flamers at the helm, said to have more devastating ranged firepower than even top-tier siege weaponry, but so powerful from range that it will quickly run out of juice and not be able to fire anymore, and it'll be forced into melee from that point on, which isn't really an issue because it's a hyper-fast flying chariot with Barrier that can quickly slice through a horde of infantry then retreat before it's taken any damage. So this thing could be straight up busted. I mean, they're talking about it just devastating entire formations in 1 or 2 volleys. And then you can use all that speed and the Barrier passive to kind of just slice stuff up with charges. It's going to be a really strong unit. For monsters and beasts, Chaos Furies trade Khorne's Frenzy for Tzeentch's Barrier, making them substantially more powerful as a backline harasser, though obviously lacking some of the former's killing power. But Barrier is going to make a lot of these low-tier, highly mobile units quite a bit more effective than they would otherwise be, if you can manage that shield well. And I think that's going to be the core feature here. Like, anything that rewards good micro and positioning is cool with me, and the fact that you are rewarded for taking good engagements and then quickly disengaging when things start getting a little bit hairy, I think that's going to be a really nice feature and make Barrier one of my favorite passives in the game. While Screamers of Tzeentch are flying demonic creatures meant for cyclo-charging and quick hit and run attacks, still remains to be seen whether Lamprey's Bite bonus for Slorge will be a feature for them, or if they'll be more of an all-around unit with high charge bonus but low to middling staying power. But it says they hit pretty hard and they can hold out okay in melee, but it definitely seems like they're more focused on the charge aspect, and their charge bonus will probably reflect that. Chaos Spawn are nothing special, neither from a gameplay or a visual perspective. We've had them for 5 years, you know what's up there. But the Lord of Change is special, even though it will be using Sartorial's old model. They are rare monsters that double as a fully fledged spellcaster, and they can bounce between units using their high mass, impressive speed, and terror. Not sure exactly how those spells will work though. Says that it's a fully fledged spellcaster, but I don't know if you'll be able to choose which spells to bring, if you'll be able to strip off the ones you don't want in custom battle or campaign, or if they all come attached no matter what you do, because paying for a bunch of spells you aren't going to use or simply don't want to use or can't use because Kairos and your main casters will be using all the wins would be kind of dumb. So if they're bound spells and not tied to the winds of magic, that almost makes more sense to me, but I'm not sure. The wording isn't all that clear. I'm not really getting the vibe that it's only bound spells. It seems like it'll be using winds of magic too, and in that case, maybe not going to use it that much, because I think Kairos or an Exalted Lord of Change is very often going to be my go-to Lord choice. And that scenario, I just can't use whatever Lord of Tzeentch or Lord of Metal spells are also going to be on my Lord of Change. I get his Winds of Magic pool is going to be bigger than it is for other factions, but there's still limits to that, and having 2 or 3 full casters just does not seem like an efficient use of Winds of Magic at all. So ideally, for me anyway, I think I'd prefer to see that you can take off some of the spells you don't want, or that all of them will just be bound spells irrespective of your Winds of Magic pool. That's probably the best bet if you want to see regular Lords of Change get used a lot on the battlefields of Warhammer 3. Now for Flamers of Tzeentch, they're kind of the quintessential Demon of Change, probably the weirdest looking unit in the setting. They're kind of like floating fungi jellyfish with way too many heads and faces, and their Warp Flame increases fire weakness of affected enemy units by 22%. So whatever they focus down, a lot of your other units will want to shoot at as well. And though they operate in groups, unlike the single entity Exalted Flamers, their damage output is still insane when positioned correctly. able to immolate entire hordes of infantry. Kind of like faster, but less resilient Iron Drakes. Then the Exalted Flamer is the SEM version, apparently wielding the most powerful range attack on the battlefield, just like the Burning Chariots they often ride, spraying cones of warp fire, demolishing formations and monsters alike, and they have low ammo, seems to be the balancing factor that will limit their overall damage output. And finally, we have the Soul Grinder, which will indeed play a different role than the Khornate, Nurglite, or Slaaneshi versions, and in Tzeentch's case, will hurl long-range anti-large Thunderbolt Spears at high-value targets, piercing armor and making it something of a monster hunter. I have confirmation from the devs now that its breath attack we saw in the Cathay and Tzeentch quest battle is a melee animation and not currently a full-on Dragon Breath equivalent, but it can seamlessly transition between melee and ranged combat, although range appears to be where it thrives. Armor-piercing bolts from downtown makes it kind of a siege attacker and a single entity sniper, rather than the Khornate one, which will probably be better in melee and have that grape shot cannon that's better for chunking through hordes of infantry. So that is the unit roster for Tzeentch in its totality, looking absolutely fantastic on the demonic side, perhaps less so on the mortal side. I've talked about that a lot, but we've had some time to let that sink in now and come to grips with all of that. I expect big things from the mortal side of the roster at a later date, particularly in the visuals department, but we may have to wait a little bit on that front. And in the meantime, at least Doom Knights and Chaos Knights sound awesome from a mechanical perspective, even if they don't look quite as cool or as unique as I would like them to. The Changer of Ways seems to have a ton of unique and interesting battlefield mechanics, from army-wide bound spells that charge up when you cast with your mages, to greater demonic summoning from your cultists, to the barrier passive, which will massively increase the effectiveness of your mobile troops when microed well. And overall, I just think there's a lot of really cool stuff here. Few disappointments, like no evidence of splitting horrors, which surprises me. I can't imagine they couldn't figure out a way to do that, so maybe they are truly holding on to that for a later date, but I just think that would be a weird decision regardless. Overall, I'm quite happy with this reveal, learned a lot from it, hope you guys did as well, and we'll be getting our first look at the new magic system, I believe, on Friday. So stay tuned for that, and keep an eye out for all my coverage for Warhammer 3 in the coming days and weeks. There's a lot of great content on the way. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video. Any Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.